back again for another course breakdown video, this time for this week's Houston Open down at Memorial Park Golf Course. Last year was the first time we ever saw this venue, and boy, it didn't disappoint. It showed some real teeth. We had a winning score of just 13 under par, being Carlos Ortiz, and overall, I'm really excited for the tour to get back here. Not only is it a municipal golf course, it's also one that's meant to resemble Augusta National, the greatest golf course in the world. You got some tricky greens here, some woodland areas that you don't really want to get it into, and overall, it makes for a real test of golf. So what we'll do here in this breakdown is we're going to go over some of the key metrics for this golf course. We'll talk about the field a little bit. Then we'll move on to a hole-by-hole analysis. We'll see where the players are going to be able to score. We'll see where they're going to have some trouble making some pars. And we'll wrap it up with our key stats for analysis and, of course, our comp courses. So you'll have everything you guys need to know for this week's event. So without further delay, we have a lot to get into. Let's start off with this week's field. So this is a full field event, which is a little bit of a nice change from what we've seen over the last month or so. We had some invitational events with the Zozo Championship and the CJ Cup. Then we had some quote-unquote full field events. It didn't quite feel like that. One had 115 players, one had just 125. So now we're going to have 156 golfers teeing it up, your normal cut line. So it's going to feel a lot more like a regular tour event. Last year's winner, like I mentioned, was Carlos Ortiz at 13 under par. There was tough scoring despite beautiful weather, which doesn't bode well if there's a lot of wind this time around. And while it's a little bit too early to be looking into that, this is Texas, and we know that it tends to be windy in general. So while they got to 13 under par last year, we could be looking at an even more difficult golf course this time around. Some headliners for this field, we have Brooks, who is a co-designer of this golf course. And yep, you heard me right. Brooks Koepka, co-designer of Memorial Park. It's not something that you would expect from him, especially this early on in his career, but this was something that he ended up taking on a few years ago. We have Sanjay M teeing it up. We have Sam Burns, who, believe it or not, is the favorite for this golf tournament. We have Adam Scott, Joaquin Niemann, Tony Finau, Cam Smith, and that's just to name a few. A very deep field. It's deep the whole way down into the 7 and even 6K range if you're looking at DFS. So overall, a very solid set of PGA Tour regulars that are going to be vying for the championship. This is typically right before the Masters. It's obviously not this year, but this venue is actually chosen to specifically resemble the greens at Augusta National. They're extremely fast, run about a 12 or a 13. There's a ton of slope on them. So that ends up being the biggest defense of this golf course. You're also going to have very similar looks off the tee from here. And then if you compare it to Augusta National, you have tons of wooded areas. They tend to be pretty dense. You can try and hit some recovery shots out of them, but it brings a lot of risk into play. Players are going to be chopping out sideways a lot more than usual at other golf courses. And especially when you consider that it's a municipal golf course. Typically, we expect those to be relatively wide open, some huge fairways and whatnot, but that's just not the case here at Memorial Park. It's a little bit of a different setup. It's not meant for your average everyday muni player. Definitely for the skilled players, even if you're playing from some of the forward tees. In terms of a setup, it is a par 70, and there's a ton of misinformation out there. I've seen par 72 some places, par 71. This is a par 70, even for the regular members there every single day. It is 7,412 yards. I've also seen incorrect yardages. I've seen close to 7,000 yards. It's 7,412 yards, making it extremely long for a par 70. It is 3 par 3s, well over 185 yards. One of them is right around 185. The other two are extremely long and difficult. The par 5s are all tough to reach as well. While they are reachable for some of the longer hitters on tour, you've got to go out there and absolutely stripe a drive to have any chance at it. This is a Tom Doak design, the same guy who ended up designing the Renaissance Club over on the European side of things. We have Bermuda grass from tee to green. That's going to be your rough. That's going to be fairways, tees, as well as your greens, which is notable, especially for the rough there. Bermuda grass rough tends to be the hardest to hit out of. Bermuda grass also tends to be the hardest to hit chips off of. So that'll definitely be leaking into our analysis when we talk about our key stats. But definitely makes this track a little bit more difficult. In terms of the size of these greens, about average sized greens. Nothing really to speak of there. They're right about 6,500 yards on square foot on average. In terms of slope, they're one of the most sloped greens on the entire PGA Tour, also running near a 13 in terms of speed. That's why we mentioned that they resemble Augusta National, obviously some of the hardest greens in the world to read. And while these aren't quite as severe, they definitely at least have a semblance of that type of a feel. In terms of the hazards, most of the hazards here are going to be wooded areas off the tee. There is some water in play. It's typically up near the greens, not really in play off of the fairways. And in terms of bunkering, we're not going to have tons of bunkering. We have 19 total bunkers on site, and only 3 of them are fairway bunkers. So the majority of them are protecting these greens. And in general, they don't make a huge impact here. You're mostly going to have chips off of that Bermuda surface around the greens, which arguably is going to be harder than hitting bunker shots. Obviously if you're non-scratch golfer, you're 7 to 10 handicap, that kind of thing, bunkers are going to scare the ever-living crap out of them. But for these PGA Tour players, those are easy. Those are an absolute cakewalk. This Bermuda grass surface tends to be one of the more difficult surfaces in general on tour. Not only do you have grain to read on the greens, tends to make some of the people that aren't as familiar with it miss a few more putts. You're also dealing with grain with your chips. And when you're chipping into the grain, it tends to be one of the most difficult shots to pull off. If you're not somebody who uses the bounce of your club particularly well, you're going to struggle mightily. So obviously people that are from Florida, from the South, that play on the surface and have for their entire life are probably going to be all right on it. You have some of these Texas guys, some of these guys from the West Coast that aren't going to have a good time. One of the few Texas guys that tends to have success on the surface is Jordan Spieth. Unfortunately, not teeing it up this week. But those guys that are used to bent grass, that are used to kind of flubbing their chips into the ground, not necessarily using the bounce, going to see a little bit of struggles from them, right? So it's something that I'll be slightly incorporating into my modeling this week. It's a little bit hard to do so. But what we'll do is we'll use shots gained short game on Bermuda grass. So something I've been working on over the last 3 to 4 months is trying to distinguish not only between putting splits when it comes to grass type, but also around the green stats, because Bermuda grass, we always hear about it. If you guys are regular with PGA Tour golf, the Bermuda grass is so hard to chip off of. So that's something I've been working on, something that we'll be implementing here for the first time here at the Houston Open. In terms of the rough, it is about 3 inches long, and it's Bermuda grass rough as well, which I already mentioned being a little bit more difficult than usual to get through. So when you're missing the fairways here, which tend to be a little bit bigger than at most golf courses, you definitely are going to see some penalty. What we'll do next is we're going to go through a hole-by-hole breakdown here at Memorial Golf and see exactly what these players are going to face. So here for hole 1, you're going to see a hole that's going to be very similar to the rest at this track. You don't have very fairway bunkers off the tee. You're dealing with not many bunkers around the green as well, and a relatively long hole at almost 500 yards. So this is going to be as typical of a par 4 as you're going to see at Memorial. In general, you're going to want to hit about a 330 yard drive in the fairway if you can. This tends to be one of the bigger tracks. If you miss, you can see there's plenty of rough over here to miss on the left, plenty of rough over there on the right before you start to get into some of these dense trees. So it's a little bit of a handshake coming out. You're not dealing with one of the harder driving holes or anything like that. And the shot into this green, relatively straightforward as well. So, and while it's going to be a long iron, while it is almost 500 yards, I do expect this to play slightly under par. Now getting to hole number 2 here, we get our first short par 3, and this is going to be the shortest par 3 on the entire golf course. So going to want to take advantage of this one right here. It's only 161 yards. Might end up playing closer to 180 yards for the tour players. I'm sure they will add an extra tee box or something like that if they feel like it. Overall, this will be a relatively scoreable hole. You do see the one bunker over here. This bunker is completely out of play. No tour player is going to have a problem with that. And overall, I expect that to be a relatively average hole in terms of our scoring. Here at hole number 3, we get the first par 5, so 585 yards. It's not short by any means, it's also not long, so some of the longer hitters on tour are going to be able to take advantage of this hole. It's one of the few holes we actually do have a fairway bunker, and it tends to be a good ways out there. That is at least 330 yards, going to be in play for some of the longer hitters on tour. So one of the strategically placed bunkers that Brooks Koepka did not take out of this setup. Next up for hole number 4, we have another par 4. This one also almost 500 yards. Very similar to hole number 1 where you have quite a bit of room off the tee to left and to the right. So expecting this to play right around average, maybe slightly under par, given that's relatively straightforward. Next up, we have one of the trickier holes at this golf course. And while it is a borderline drivable par 4, this ended up playing way over par last year. This fairway bunker up here ended up being extremely penal, players ended up getting stuck in it way more than you would expect. And this green up here is almost like a volcano. It's up on a plateau. It's hard to keep balls on. And overall, you had guys missing over the green, and they were just having an absolute horrible time with it. Again, these greens are extremely sloped. So when you miss on the wrong side, you're going to be penalized to the fullest extent. And that's really what they did on this drivable par 4. It's only drivable for the longer hitters on tour anyways, like a Brooks Koepka, Sam Burns, and they have to absolutely smash one. So you're going to see a lot of players this week, especially after what you saw last year, probably lay up here with an iron, that sort of thing, and then hit a wedge into the screen. It's just a far more optimal strategy. Taking on all of that risk, particularly with this fairway bunker right here, is just unnecessary. This fairway bunker is extremely penal. The average score was 5.1 out of that bunker, so not really what you want to see. Next up, we had hole number 6. Was probably the easiest hole at this golf course at only 441 yards. You don't have any hazards off the tee. It's the easiest approach shot of the entire golf course. Definitely a birdie opportunity right there. So if you're able to take advantage of that short par 4, the 388-yard one, you could definitely see yourself on a birdie streak here, which brings us to hole number 7, though. So it's unlikely to cap at hole number 7. You're probably going to have to take that birdie at hole number 4 and ride it through hole number 6. This is a brute of a hole. Not only is it over 200 yards, you're dealing with one of the most sloped greens on the entire golf course. It can be extended as well. They have an additional tee box back here where it can play almost 240 yards. We'll have to see if they end up experimenting with that. Now for hole number 8. Hole number 8 is a very long par 5. It is not reachable by even the longest players. You'd have to have a severe downwind to have any chance at it. So while it is a birdie opportunity, it's not quite the birdie opportunity that we see at most golf venues. And now for hole number 9. 182-yard par 3. It's going to play closer to 200 yards exactly. They did add an additional tee box back here that they're using for the PGA Tour. So not going to be quite as easy as it looks here on paper, just 182 yards. You're looking at players using a 5, potentially even a 4-iron for some of the shorter hitters. So definitely not something that you're looking to really score on. Hole number 10 is a handshake. So if you have your guys starting on hole number 10 rather than hole number 1, you're going to be at an advantage. You're dealing with a much shorter hole. This fairway bunker up here shouldn't really cause them any problems. Even if they're hitting into it, it's only going to cause problems to a front left pin location. So I think if you're starting on the back 9, you're at the very least going to be starting with a little bit less of a headache. Hole number 11, though, gives you that headache once again. It's a 240-yard par 3. That should tell you everything you need to know about it. Some of these guys are going to have to hit 3-wood into it. Next up, we have hole number 12. It's a long par 4. Also one where you're probably trying to just get a par at. Tends to be very difficult because you don't have that much room off the tee. Probably only 10 to 20 yards over here to the right. A little bit more room to the left, but not an ideal angle because of the trees in your way. Hole number 13 is a short par 4. This is by far the most scoreable par 4 on the golf course. It's only 330 yards. Don't have water in play. You do have the very pinched fairway, so you're dealing with not much room to the right, not much room to the left to miss or anything like that. But for the better drivers on the PGA Tour, that should be a very good birdie hole. Hole number 14 is one of the longer par 4s on the golf course. Almost thought this was a par 5 or something. This is a par 4. It's only 525 yards. It's tough. They're going to have a hard time parring that hole. Ended up being one of the harder holes last year. You have the shortest par 3 on the golf course next. They have 2 tee boxes they can come from that you guys see over here. Not really much to speak of. This is an easier hole for these guys. Hole 16 is the last par 5, last of the 2. It's 585 yards. Reachable, but you guys can see that water comes into play. It's one of the few holes where water is really a prominent feature. Going for 2 is extremely risky. We saw a ton of people rinse golf balls last year. So having elite length does make this easier. You're hitting from more in this range into the green rather than from back here. And now for hole 17. This isn't drivable by any means. It may look like it potentially could be because it's probably only 300 effective yardage over here. But you have trees blocking you out. So they weren't taking it out at all. It wasn't really possible. You'd have to hit a mega fade into it, like a power fade, like 360 yards, which I don't think anyone on tour is capable of. Maybe Bryson DeChambeau if he uses his long drive swing, but not going to be hitting it on planet Earth if he does so. So 380 yards, it's still going to be scoreable for the guys with good irons. You're hitting about a 4-5 iron out there to right around where that 17 is, and then a little flip shot in. So Should be a scoreable hole. Obviously, if you miss right, you're going to be into some trouble. So that's why you're going to see an emphasis on driving accuracy here in a second. We're going to get into our key stats. Making sure you stay out of that water, making sure that you stay out of those trees is going to be a big deal this week. If you can do that, this course is relatively scoreable. You're just going to have to hit some good irons, get up and down when you miss these relatively small greens. And then finally, 18. This is a absolute brute. This is a par 4. It's 500 yards. You got 3 bunkers on this hole. You're dealing with also a very sloped green. So overall, they wanted to make the last hole a test. They wanted to make it interesting for guys coming down the stretch, and they definitely got what they asked for there. And now for the key stats. First off, we have shots gained approach at number 3, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, as it is a staple of our analysis week to week. Shots gained approach will be important here because you're going to have a ton of long irons into these hard par 4s. We have some 500-yard par 4s, some long par 5s as well. So overall, making sure that you hit these small greens is going to be very helpful. Next up, we have shots gained short game, but on Bermuda grass. So something I've added into my database, have an ability to sort by not only the best players on the greens on Bermuda grass, but also on Bermuda grass around the green, which if you guys know anything about Bermuda, it's definitely an interesting surface to play on. You're dealing with grain changes, and if you're hitting into the green with your chips, tends to be by far the hardest surface to play on. So for us, we're not only incorporating that bias with our putting, but also with our around the green play, and this is how we're doing so. But now for our number 1, we have shots gained off the tee. We're going to be putting an emphasis on accuracy though, like I mentioned during our hole by hole breakdown. And one major consistency from player to player when they were asked about this golf course last year was driving accuracy. They talked about how it was so much easier to play from the fairway. Obviously the rough has a lot to do with that. We have 3-inch Bermuda rough, but even more so than that, you have the hazards off the tee. You have the water hazards, particularly on those par 5s, the woods that come into play, and overall, at a place that's going to be hard to score on these greens, you want to make sure you're at least not bleeding strokes with your ball striking. I mean, this is a municipal golf course, so as long as you're keeping the ball in the fairway, you shouldn't run into too much trouble. All of the people that finished in the top 5 last year had a maximum of 4 bogeys. That should really tell you everything you need to know. They went out there, they were really keeping the ball in play, they weren't making a ton of big scores or anything like that, and that really showed with the people at the top of the leaderboard. So that's why it comes in at number 1. Again, not just off the tee though, an emphasis on that accuracy. Now for our comp courses, first off we have Augusta National Golf Club, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. We have greens that are extremely tricky with a ton of slope that also have a ton of speed. We also have a ton of looks here off the tee that resemble Augusta National Golf Club as well. So going to be something I'm using in my modeling for this week. Next up though, we have Liberty National Golf Course, home of the Northern Trust for this year. We have a lot of hazards off the tee there. Accuracy off the tee comes at a premium. We're also looking at ball striking efficiency and around the green numbers. So one of the few tough tracks where you really have to be really good from tee to green to get it done. So definitely a golf course that I'm looking at for this week as well. But lastly, we have PJ National, another golf course with some really tough greens, ton of slope, Bermuda grass, also just a relatively tough golf course in general. So, and while wind tends to be a huge factor at PJ National, and it wasn't for Memorial Park last year, it could this year. We're in Texas, we're in Houston. Tends to be a lot windier there than at most places. It's where we have the Texas wedge, everything like that. So for me, PGA National going to be a good comp course that I'm using in my modeling as well. That is all I've got for my course breakdown this week. Go ahead and let me know down in the comments what you think the winning score this week is going to be. Personally, I've got it at 9 under par. I think the wind is going to be a little bit of a larger factor this week than it was for last year, but go ahead and let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And as always, I appreciate all of your support here on the channel. If you guys haven't already liked the video, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, make sure you guys go ahead and do so. We're going to have my Draftkings picks coming out throughout the week. We're going to have value plays, fades, and sleepers. And of course, we're going to have our weekly DFS live stream on Wednesday as well. It'll be at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. So any fantasy golf questions you have at all for this week, make sure to stop on by and we'll make all of our lineups together. So until then, good luck with all of your lineups for this week and peace.